and greetings from Oxford, a very sunny Oxford actually, and from my office in the school. So, despite the pandemic, we're up and running as we have been for the last couple of months for the MBA and for MFE students, and it's bright sunshine and blue skies outside. So it's great to see you, those of you joined us from the UK and around the world. And not a few familiar faces and names as well, looking as people were signing in from the waiting room. For those of you who don't know me, I've been at the school, as Viola kind of hinted at, for more years than I care to remember, certainly. In fact, not only do I recall being shown around the building site at Park End Street, but I also taught on the first few years of the MBA when we were hosted in the Radcliffe Infirmary in rooms just above the magnetic resonance imaging scanner, which used to play havoc with our PowerPoint slides. More recently, for the last about 7 years, I ran along with one of our associate fellows, Alan Giles, an MBA elective on retailing. And before that, for a few years, an elective on e-commerce. So it's an area that I've always been interested in, and it's great to be able to share some of my thoughts with you this evening. I originally trained as a geographer, and so space, location, and real estate originally fascinated me. So the implications of longer term working from home, for example, and what that will mean for reduced need and densities of retail and office space are really interesting sort of ideas for me, particularly around the kind of future of cities and towns in which retailing have played such an important part. But I'm also interested in terms of space in respect of omni-channel, the spatial aspects of changing consumer demand and the nature of business models and of innovations required to actually deliver against some of the omni-channel requirements. So let me give you a sense of how we're planning to run the next 90 minutes. I'm going to kick off with 25 minutes of sort of commentary and thoughts and observations on the longer term context and implications for the changing retail landscape. And to do that, I'm going to draw on some of the ideas, let's reach through here, of second edition of a book I've been working on with colleagues over the last couple of years. It's the sort of COVID-ready edition of the title. But in 25 minutes, I'm just going to scratch the surface in terms of thinking about some of the longer term trends. I'll then turn to introduce our esteemed panel for their thoughts and observations. I'll introduce them at that point. And we'll then break into smaller groups after that discussion with the panel to do some networking. And I'll pose a question for you all to consider alongside getting to know each other within the breakout groups. And I should say, as we go along through the session and indeed the panel session, do please post questions into the chat, and we'll do our best. I'll do my best to answer those as we go along. But we certainly have plenty of questions lined up for our panel members in about half an hour's time. And then after the breakout, we'll reconvene for a couple of reflections on those conversations, and we'll aim to close as promptly as we can at 1:30. So let me perhaps share my screen first, and we'll kick off with my first kind of 25 minutes of comments. And so you should be able to see, I think, the Singapore gardens at night, beautifully lit up. And in fact, one of my last overseas trips before lockdown was to Singapore, which is a fantastic place to be. Looking forward to getting back as soon as I can. And in my remarks this evening, what I'd like to do is really divided into two parts. I want to set the context for a discussion of the more immediate challenges that the retail sector faces, particularly in the light of the pandemic worldwide, and particularly in relation to some of the acceleration of trends that we've seen over the last year in many markets and geographies. And to do that, I want to look a bit further back, but also look a bit further forward at some of the broader trends that are affecting the sector and the stakeholders within that sector worldwide, and really try and pose some questions and challenges to you as the audience and to our panel members around some of the longer term forces working to shape the retail sector, but also to remind us in looking back initially that perhaps there's a certain hubris about being in the moment and saying, well, these are the most dramatic transformations to affect a particular sector, when in fact, retailing as a sector has always been about change. There have always been winners and losers, extraordinary competitive marketplace. There have always been new entrants, new business models. And in some senses, the kind of stability we've had for the last 15 years in many geographies has been unusual in the context of a history of disruption and of innovation and of change. I wanted to try and reflect some of that in my comments this evening. So to kick this off, I think we've heard enough about me. Let's look back. And as this quote kind of suggests, it's so difficult, isn't it, to see what's going on when you're in the absolute middle of something. It's only with the benefit of hindsight that we can see things for what they truly are. And it does pay us, perhaps, to look a little further back than the history of the internet, to look back at the way in which the retail sector has responded to disruptive pressures over not just the last 10 years, but perhaps the last 100 years. And I want to give you a flavor of the kind of disruptions that the sector has experienced and grown from over that extended period of time. Some lessons from retail history, if you like. And it seemed very appropriate to kick off with some initial remarks about the pandemic, because of course, just as we have improperly titled pandemics today, so we had improperly titled pandemics in 1918, the so-called Spanish flu, which in fact may have started in the middle of the US rather than Spain, but the name has stuck over time. And I give you this example not so much to illustrate the fact that this was significantly worse as a public health emergency than the present pandemic, at least at the moment, where something like 500 million people were infected with that particularly nasty version of flu, which attacked the young, especially, rather than older people, as the present pandemic is doing. And where the number of deaths were estimated to be about 50 million worldwide, rather than the present around about 3 million for the present pandemic. But as much to illustrate the way in which some of the responses to that pandemic were very similar to today's responses. So if you look, for example, at the steps taken to fight influenza, hours of factories were fixed. There were closing orders for all stores except food and drug shops, which sounds, again, a very familiar kind of story. Timetables for theatres, regulations necessary to prevent shutting city up tight. So there were tensions at the time about closing things down, keeping things open, keeping things trading, and so on. But equally, thinking about the growth of online retailing during the pandemic, in 1918, there were also recommendations to stay at home and shop by phone. So the technology at the time, the preferred technology as the alternative to going to stores, was actually to shop by phone. And authorities relaxed the regulations around home deliveries, for example, which had been prescriptive in some geographies. But they also closed, big stores as a result of the flu at that time. So we see many kinds of parallels, even to public health emergencies and the retail response over 100 years ago. But other kinds of change and pressure have acted on the sector over that period as well. One of the biggest types of change to have affected retailing is, of course, technological change. And in fact, retailing has always been driven in part by technological change. If we just think about the impact of the railways in the 19th century, maritime transport, steamships, being able to get products through initially very complex supply chains, very extended supply chains, more quickly to places of demand, the proliferation of products, the opportunities for large groups of retailers to gang together to make procurement in a group way overseas. The early IT developments in terms of information systems, the growth of the family motor car, and the ability we had to drive to a retail store away from our neighborhood to make a particular purchase. And some of the illustrations on this slide, for example, the moving staircase. That example on the bottom right of the slide is taken from Harrods in London. And it's an example, again, of a technical innovation that permitted stores to trade much more easily from more than one floor, because you could get more easily from one floor to the next as a customer. Or at least you could once you got used to it, because when moving staircases were first introduced in North America and in Western Europe, there was a consternation. Customers would get to the top of the escalator and faint because the speed had been so great in moving from floor to floor. And there were sales assistants positioned at the top of each escalator with smelling salts to revive those people that had fainted, having gone through the dramatic technological change of an escalator journey from floor to floor. But we also see things like the refrigerator, for example, as being a technological enabler of food retailing for storage, both in retail stores, but also, of course, in the home. And those other two devices we see there. One of these was the invention of the cash register, which goes back to an American called James Ritty in 1883, who invented something called the incorruptible cashier, because the main reason cash registers were invented was to try and prevent shrinkage, theft by employees rather than theft by customers. And this model of till was actually developed when Ritty saw the way in which ships controlled their movement and speed, the signaling devices to the engine room, the way that was signaled remotely. And this first model, which was then taken on by National Cash Registers, NCR, was the very first cash register, which transformed, again, the economic productivity and viability of retail stores. Similarly, in terms of information systems, we see some of the earliest information systems consisting of pneumatic tubes in the 19th, early 20th centuries. In fact, the last of these systems was uninstalled from a department store in the UK only around about 15 years ago. And certainly when I got my first job in retail as a trainee, as a sort of summer job, the department store I worked for had one of these pneumatic tube systems, moving information physically around the store, allowing cash to be sent to secure location, allowing receipts to be delivered, and so on to the customer. And so you could see the pneumatic tube system as a precursor of information systems worldwide. And we see that too with business models. So we talked today about the death of the department store. And we see in many geographies and many markets, well-known brands going to the wall, becoming bankrupt. But of course, we have to remember that the department store was a relatively new concept in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, particularly North America and Western Europe. And at the time, it was not well received. So the growth of one store business in London, Whiteley's, was met by the burning of an effigy of its owner in the streets by specialist shopkeepers. We haven't yet seen today, Jeff Bezos being burnt at the stake in effigy form by shopkeepers anxious about Amazon. But what goes around comes around, and the cycle of behavior in retailing is just this kind of cyclical business model approach. And secondly, we can see that in what was then mail order, and some similarities with the experience today. The growth of Montgomery Ward as a world-leading mail order business. And if we look at the detailed brochure there, it talks about supplies for every trade and calling on earth, the largest mail order business in the US, a newcomer, a new entrant to the marketplace in the 1880s, which was seen as a threat by established businesses and even by the press. So the Chicago Tribune said, beware, don't patronize Montgomery Ward & Co. They are deadbeats. In fact, they keep altogether retired from the public gaze and are only to be reached through correspondence sent to a certain box in the post office. And I won't draw any direct parallels, but certainly if we look at Amazon's mission statement to build a place where people can come to find and discover anything they might want to buy online on a global basis, that mission is not so dissimilar to that of Montgomery Ward. And we see that too with supply chain and logistics, where we see companies in 1900 putting in place sort of greetings cards about what the future might look like. And this is the view from 1900 of what the rural postman will be like in the year 2000, delivering via drone. And of course, we have these kinds of industrial strength drones available today. And we see a chocolate company in Germany saying, let's think about the future of retailing in the year 2000. And they imagined mobile retailing as putting shops on trains and moving them around to where the demand was. And again, apart from the fact that we now have much more mobile commerce with these, the similarities with today's behaviors are very interesting. So today, for example, the story is around a genius ordering his Domino's pizza from one rail station whilst on the train and having it delivered at the next station, because Domino's was pretty smart in getting their local franchisee to deliver the pizza up the line. So trains play an important part in mobile retailing. But if that's looking back, what are the kinds of big challenges that retailing faces looking forward? Let me spend the other half of my time allotted to this presentation talking a bit about the future. And this is a further future, but perhaps the future we're going to be talking about in our panel discussion. In our discussion, I want our panelists to think about very much the now and the recovery from the pandemic and the future shape of retailing beyond that point. But I want to go a bit further out in these remarks. I want to talk a bit about the certainty of uncertainty and some of the longer term challenges the sector faces, because we think that the pandemic is all consuming, but in fact, there have been a number of other longer term forces acting on the sector, which will help shape it. And I think it's very, very good to have this quote by Jesper Brodin, CEO of IKEA Group, who almost demonstrates the appetite of the best equipped retailers to think very positively about this uncertain future, rather than to despair and say, what are we going to do? Online retailing will kill us and so on. Like most retailers, he says, we don't know exactly where we will land at the end of it being this uncertain period of change, but our curiosity and willingness to create will be a guide for us. And in a sense, that speaks to the essential innovativeness and creativeness of the retail sector worldwide. But this certainty of uncertainty is echoed by a lot of the longer term scenario exercises done by governments, by armies, by academics around the world. And this example I've got here on the left is something done by the UK Ministry of Defence on a biannual basis, where they look much further out, in this case 2050, about the kinds of issues that will face particular sectors. Now, I've drawn out 5 trends that I'll talk about very briefly as, I think, compelling global trends that will have significant impacts, if uncertain impacts, on the retail sector. And the first of these is, of course, the pandemic recovery. And looking at that, of course, the biggest difficulty is that we will face recovering not just from a health crisis, but from an economic crisis. Not only do we have 140 million cases of COVID having been reported worldwide to date, around 3 million deaths, but we also see many forecasters talking about a dip in global GDP of around about 4.3% last year, 7.4% for Europe, and that's slightly better than had been expected, but also a slow recovery to some extent. And it's worth looking at this conference board chart, which shows the comparison between the recovery from the last financial crisis and the present COVID public health crisis. The faded lines are the global financial crisis. And you can see the dip was much lower in both emerging markets and in mature economies compared to the very severe dip for the COVID recession of 2020. But equally, the recovery out of that COVID recession is seen to be much steeper than for the recovery from the global financial crisis. So what does this mean for retailing? Which sectors, which formats, which types of consumer will be the winners and losers? It's something we're going to discuss in some more detail in a few minutes. But equally, do we see this accelerating of online activity being sustained beyond the end of the pandemic? And will that be at the cost of the physical space that retailing has previously traded from? What will be the implications for global supply chains as markets slowly open up and as trade becomes a little smoother? And what will this mean for local as against national demand and supply? What we've seen certainly over the pandemic in many markets with lockdowns is people being constrained either to physical bricks and mortar retailing in their local area, and perhaps rediscovering or discovering for the first time new types of retailing, or relying on online. So these are really open questions, but it's not the only set of questions which preoccupy retailers. The second one is around managing socio-demographic change. And certainly pre-pandemic, one of the biggest longer-term challenges was seen to be the increase in migration, the increase in urbanization across the world. And the map shows the increase in population to 2035 in world cities. And you can see that the light blue, which is the expansion beyond the late 90s, is actually to be seen in Africa, in parts of Southeast Asia, and particularly amongst what are often considered to be secondary or tertiary tier cities. So we see, pre-pandemic, a growing globalization tendency, and we see also a big migration tendency. And what are the implications for retailing of this? What does this do, for example, for the growth of convenience stores, that ubiquitous format that we often find so useful, will those be in effect the dominant form of retailing when we have congested, very densely occupied urban areas, if we do over that period of time? Will we also need to invest in high density urban supply chains and distribution systems? And finally, of course, because of migration, because of the emergence of really multicultural urban environments, will require greater attention to be given to really highly diverse population needs. The third trend is around technology. And here, again, going beyond, if you like, some of the immediate technological opportunities and challenges, think about the reality looking to 2045 or 2050 of some of the more strategic advances in technology around, for example, human augmentation, thinking in terms of sensory augmentation, our ability to see and hear more, but also physical and cognitive augmentation as well, making us smarter, making us more connected, perhaps augmenting our physical strength. And secondly, around automation, unmanned systems and robotics, where robots perhaps are as ubiquitous as computers are today, according to many of the sorts of scenarios being thought about. Again, what are the implications for retailing of those trends? What will shoppers be able to do that they can't do now with enhanced cognitive skills and abilities? What will the advances in virtual reality and augmented reality mean for the nature of retailing over that length of time? Of course, whilst we as shoppers and consumers might be gathering abilities and intelligence ourselves in the retail space, retailers also will be able to gather much more data about our behaviors and gain much more insight. But will those companies have the skills and the talent to sufficiently well analyze that data as it comes through? So what does it mean for our education systems to deliver data scientists in sufficient quantities for firms to be able to do this kind of analysis? And then finally, the potential for other types of technologies, whether that's additive manufacturing, 3D printing, and so on, which might entirely substitute for certain physical types of retailing or even online types of retailing through an ability to actually produce your own product in the comfort of your own home over the next few decades. So there are some, I think, some substantial strategic issues to be addressed in terms of technological advancement. The fourth trend is around resource scarcity and environmental stress. And here I think we're very much aware of these challenges in a contemporary sense, as well as in the longer term sense. We see increasing competition and demand for resources. Just thinking about water shortages, nearly 4 billion people worldwide suffering water shortages. We already can quantify the cost of climate change and companies and countries coming round to very much the insights that will have to drive structural change in organizations and in countries and our own behaviors over the next few years. And so retail firms like others will need to develop more resilient strategies. What will they look like? Are we going to see the end of polarization between haves and have-nots in the marketplace? So will we see global lifestyle changes affecting retailers and the way in which they develop their supply chains, attitudes towards countries of origin and extended supply chains, last mile in terms of online deliveries and so on, and the role and location of stores through this kind of pressure for improved credentials on sustainability? And we see, for example, these kinds of issues being reflected in government policies. So Anne Hidalgo in Paris, Mayor of Paris, seriously contemplating a move towards what she's called the Ville du 4 heures, the 15-minute city, where every resource, whether that's retailing, leisure, the workplace, our friends, restaurants, are all within a 15-minute walk of our home. And again, for retailing, that has some significant implications in terms of the types of store, locations of the store, if you have physical stores, and the nature and function of online distribution systems. We can already see some cities giving up on bricks and mortar retailing and converting that into more acceptable uses. So here in Stockton in northeastern England, knocking down a shopping centre and building a park in its place. And my final example, before I conclude, is I think one of the most significant ones, which is around power transition and diffusion. And this is a notion where we see perhaps state authorities finding it difficult to cope with companies that are bigger than countries. And indeed, Mark Zuckerberg was on record as saying, companies over countries was one of his early mottos. thinking again about the ability to regulate and to intervene to correct market imperfections, the ability that some jurisdictions may have not to be able to intervene in ways that they would regard as necessary. Facebook behaving like North Korea, says the headline, as Australia wakes up to news ban. The debate about online sale taxes worldwide and so on. So again, for retailing, we see non-state actors emerging as dominant retailers, whether they're e-commerce platforms or other kinds of organizations. We have the question for traditional retailers about whether they should collaborate with these new players. And we have the emergence of marketplaces seeking to dominate particular geographies and states seeking to intervene. So think about the $2 billion fine for Alibaba in China as being one kind of sort of shot across the bows from a government for the untrammeled growth of a particular kind of business model. And we also know that there's a legislative lag which prevents governments from acting in a timely and agile way to regulate new forms of business, particularly in the areas of e-commerce. So those 5 broad future-facing forces, I think, are those which will largely determine the shape and function and nature of retailing over the next period, in addition to the immediate response to the pandemic. So let me pause at this point. I'm going to change kind of mode. I've been standing up for this bit. I'm going to just move my camera down a little bit and ask our panel members to join us on the screen if they haven't already done so, and we'll turn to some discussion with our panel members. As I said, we have a something of a star-studded panel to consider, not just the longer-term issues that I've raised, but I think also some of the more immediate questions by the retail sector's response to the pandemic. So let me introduce our panel. We have Olga Nazarkova, MBA from 2007, Siddharth Nambiar, MBA from 2008, Tyler Herbert, an MBA from 2011, and to break the MBA trend, delighted to welcome Mark Noble from the 2017 cohort of the Oxford Strategic Leadership Programme, which I much enjoyed being a tutor on over the last few years. It's a great piece of our executive education portfolio. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes with them, asking them to introduce themselves in turn, and perhaps just spend a couple of minutes talking a bit about their backgrounds and where they are now, but also commenting on what they've agreed with or violently disagreed with about what I've had to say, or think that is missing from that kind of appreciation of the future challenges facing the sector. So I'm going to start looking left to right on my screen, at least, with Olga. Olga, would you care to kick us off with just a couple of minutes commentary on that?
Hi, everyone. Very nice to see you all. Thanks, Jonathan. Very interesting start for our discussion. So a little bit about my background. As Jonathan said, I think I graduated around 2008 and as an MBA. Did his class on retailing. This is where I got really excited about retailing and consumer, and went on my retail/e-commerce career. So I spent a few years with Mothercare as global e-commerce director, launching online in 64 markets for them. Obviously, now the situation with Mothercare is a little bit difficult compared to when I was there, but at the time it was really interesting, and I got to work with physical retail as well as online, multi-channel. Then moving on to Amazon, where I was managing one of their businesses and then launching the UK exports business and also kind of international sales solution called Global Store. Then moved to Turkey to run online fashion, modest fashion player called Modernisa as a chief commercial officer. And just recently, I joined a company called funkypigeon.com. Those of you in UK probably know the song and the bird, but as a chief executive officer. So my career kind of last 12 years was all in retail and online. And really happy that I actually ended up in this sector. Thank you to Jonathan for supporting all the way. In terms of what you said, I think stay at home, shop by phone. This is wow. This is really interesting that 100 years on, but we're still kind of there. And it talks a lot about the innovation, as you said, in the sector. So this is exactly what I've experienced in the last 10 years. constant change in the sector and technology-wise particularly. But during pandemic, a couple of things that you said were extremely relevant. One was a bit big data. I think over the last 10 years, the big data has been, mentioned so many times, but now we come to really deal with it on a day-to-day basis in all of our jobs, because online and digital became such a big part during the COVID. So definitely there's a shortage of skill set in the market, and we need more institutions to deal with it. And meanwhile, I think, it's a big gap. And second, what you said, companies over countries, which became really apparent, I think, in the last 12 months. And I see that government will become much more aggressive and proactive in this space. Europe hopefully will lead the charge for change, not US. And definitely the online tax is going to be something big to watch, because it's going to change a lot of dynamics in P&L. And these are the two things that I just wanted to highlight from what you said, Jonathan.
Olga, thank you very much for that. Let me turn to Tyler, who's next on my screen, for your background and some comments.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, quick thank you to you, Jonathan, also to Laura and Viola for inviting me to be a participant as part of this discussion. I think it's really interesting, especially given the COVID implications as we're all living through. Quick background, as Jonathan mentioned, I matriculated in 2011 to the MBA program. I've spent my entire career in commercial real estate, which has been about 15 years or so, primarily in the US. I started with Cushman & Wakefield doing investment sales and structured finance. And then during the GFC, moved into CMBS debt restructuring for CW Capital, and we got bought by Fortress. Primarily focused on all types of property, but I did have a large swath of retail, so power centers, mixed-use developments, grocery anchored shopping, et cetera. I spent some time with Deloitte's real estate consulting group after the MBA, and then moved to Invesco, where I was focused on acquisitions and asset management across really the mid-Atlantic for the US. With Invesco, I did have, again, a lot of retail in my portfolio, grocery anchored shopping centers, a lot of urban infill in the DC area and other markets across the East Coast. And more recently, after Invesco, I actually joined a company called Convene that really thought about the future of office buildings functioning more like a full service hotel. And so it was primarily meetings and events company with a portfolio of flex workspace. That really tried to bridge the gap between, I think, office, retail, and hospitality, which was interesting. Most recently, I've started my own company with two partners called Gravel Road Partners, and we're focused on opportunistic investments right now, really around conversion of distressed hotels into workforce housing. In terms of some of the things that you mentioned, Jonathan, I tended to agree with most of what you said, which is a little frightening, I guess.
That's worrying. I mean,
yeah.
As an Oxford student, you should be disagreeing.
Exactly. Yeah. I think one thing that stood out to me was, the comment that retail has always been driven in part by technological change. And again, relevant to today's environment, I find it interesting that traditional supply chain logistics that you mentioned, freight, rail, highway, have historically been a major component of the technological success of retail, which I think is interesting and ironic. That trend's continuing today and has been exacerbated by the pandemic. I think major distribution centers and transit routes have transformed real estate landscapes across traditional product categories. So for instance, this given rise to industrial and warehouse attractiveness for institutional investment, which has been performing amongst the best throughout the pandemic, in addition to multifamily. Last mile being a large consideration of that as well that you mentioned. And it's really forced the rethinking of formerly, what was contemplated as obsolete or functionless space in certain assets that now has become incredibly attractive from a logistical standpoint. And so I think the technological retail success has given rise to this adaptive reuse of traditionally retail-focused product type into more institutionally industrial fulfillment style product on the back end, which ironically is driving the retail success on the online database. So, yeah.
I mean, there's been real proliferation in the types of new types of real estate that are emerging to service this hybrid model. It's very interesting. I have to say, I love your company name. Gravel Road is so evocative. Just imagine that. Mark, now here's somebody who is working for an organisation which we all aspire to go along to once the lockdown's been lifted, I think. But Mark, tell us a bit about yourself and reaction.
Yes. Yeah. Hi, everyone. And thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Laura, for organizing the event and inviting me. Yeah, I'm speaking from Cape Town, and quite interesting the point towards the end of your talk, Jonathan, with climate change. I don't know if you've been watching the news, but we've had a big fire on Table Mountain today. And yesterday,
Cape Town University was badly hit, wasn't it?
Yeah, really badly hit. And unfortunately, out of all the buildings that hit, it hit the library. Which
library.
If you're going to pick one not to hit, that would be the one. So still raging in the background. So
really,
thankfully, hasn't affected this little corner of Cape Town yet. But I'm working currently at the waterfront. I've been there for 11 years at the V&A waterfront. It's a 123 hectare mixed-use development, basically an extension of it's a mini privately owned city as part of Cape Town, focused around 100,000 square meter retail mall. But it's a real mix of absolutely everything from industrial to cultural, retail, commercial, residential, and cultural. The projects I've been involved there over the last while that kept me out of trouble. I created and led the development of the Silo District, which is a mixed-use development focused around an old grain silo, which was built in the 1920s, and we converted that with Heatherwick Studios from London into a new contemporary art museum, which was a great way to kind of build a cathedral around which all the other developments could operate off. So yeah, I'm very much bringing the builder's perspective to the talk today. And previous to that, I spent a few years in the Middle East. I was in Dubai, had the honor of working on the architectural wonder that is Jumeirah Beach Residence, and then before that, I was in London working on a few projects in the centre of town there. Very, very strong interest and passion in the built environment. So I'm going to try and bring that perspective to the conversation today.
Fantastic.
In terms of the points that you raise, the history and retail is ever changing, and it's constantly changing. And as you rightly said, I mean, we're all looking at this as this massive change, but it's just the next step in a evolution of constant change. And I really enjoyed the sharing of the sort of big tectonic shifts in technology that have created significant change in the retail environment, and one being the car, and how that enabled massive urban sprawl and suburban retail malls, particularly in places like North America and South Africa as well, and how the trend of car usage is potentially going to be changing now. And you also threw out the slide of Paris and the 15-minute city, and I think one of the things the pandemic's really done has focused people on their community and on their local community, and discovering what's happening within that environment, and how is that trend going to play out over the next while. And I think it'd be really interesting to explore that and see where that's going to go. And I just love the picture that you threw up of the vacuum slides. I've got a big thing for vacuum slides. I just love the thing of shooting across the roof.
They're fantastic. I mean, it's a real geek's paradise, that sort of environment.
I love it.
Thanks very much indeed. Jumeirah Beach, I stayed there. It's a brilliant resort, I have to say. It's just fantastic. So if you had anything to do with it, you have my grateful thanks. And last but not least, Sid. Now, Sid, everyone's agreed with me so far, so I hope you're going to find a point of disagreement with what I've had to say. But over to you.
I'd love to disagree. Let's see. So, quick intro. Siddharth Nambiar. I run the grocery business for Amazon in India. I set up this business 7 years ago when we launched Amazon here in India, and had the privilege of building the 3 separate businesses that today make up this sort of single grocery umbrella. So we started out with what we call gourmet grocery, which is a fulfilled by Amazon business model, added the Prime Now local fulfillment within 2-hour business, and then added Amazon Fresh and Pantry over the past few years. And we're now slowly decluttering the customer experience as we figured out which model works in which part of the country, similar to other geographies. I also now lead our healthcare area, which includes the pharmacy area and several other related areas that we're building next. Previously was at Rocket Internet, a venture capital fund based out of Germany, where I helped run the India portfolio. And before that was based in the UK for 5 years in consulting for investment banks. And in terms of your presentation, Jonathan, yes, I agree that technology plays a big role in how retail is being transformed. But I suppose many people think of where I work Amazon as a retailer. And in fact, from the inside, we often feel, and I speak in my personal capacity, obviously not representing Amazon, but we often feel that the startups around us are the ones that have a higher rate of adoption of the newest technologies and a faster ability to propagate these technologies into their relatively limited spheres of influence. Whereas as this company, this leviathan of a company across the globe with what we think of as fairly dated legacy systems that are in some cases 20, 30 years old, we struggle actually to adopt what many people may think of as cutting edge technologies and look jealously at the younger startups who are able to do so with pace and intensity that we can't. So while I do agree that technology plays a big role, I think that since this company's name came up a few times in your presentation, I point out that we actually from the inside don't believe we have the latest. Things like Ocado, since they do grocery too, I can assure you, we very much have human beings doing everything in our warehouses. We don't have the sort of automation that Ocado can boast, which is 100% automation.
That's a salutary reminder, actually, Sid. Really interesting point, I think, that you make, that actually we've almost seen accelerated organizational aging in the last kind of 10 years. That, no matter how quickly you think you're acting, there's always someone acting a bit faster than you, someone a bit ahead of you that you wish you were like. And I think that's a very sort of interesting insight into the nature of organizational change at the moment, not just in retailing, but in other sectors, I think. So thank you for that. What I thought we might do, we've got 15, 20 minutes for some conversation. I thought we might split this between kind of two broad topics, thinking about changing consumer behavior, but then, if you like, the retail response. I thought we might perhaps start off with the consumer, because that's where retailing ought to always start off, by thinking about how the shopper and the consumer is changing. As shoppers, many of us in the pandemic have been jolted out of our habits. Many of us have tried new retailers, whether local to us or online. I suppose my first question is, how lasting are some of these emerging consumer behaviors going to be in different geographies? Or will we snap back into our old forms of behavior? Olga, do you want to kick us off with your thoughts on the, if you like, the elasticity of customer behavior? Are things going to snap back to the old normal? Will we see something in between, or will we stay where we are?
I think I tend to think that a lot of habits will get stuck just because of how long the pandemic has been around. What they say, usually you need 60 days to form a new habit, and it's been more than a year. But I do think, certain things, as we will discuss, I think later, proven to be done not out kind of convenience, but more of a necessity. And I think for those, customers will decide where they want to go, to the store or online. In terms of specific, I think, a couple of trends that I see that definitely will stay in my mind, one being social media boom. If before this was only certain sectors have seen its thriving, but with social media commerce, you can shop from Instagram. There's more and more, in China, this is booming crazy, Asia as well. What we've seen, like in my previous business, for example, during pandemic, where when it started, emotional part of connection with customer became extremely important. So not just transactional, but the tone of voice, what your brand stands for, what's your brand purpose. And, a lot of retailers shifted to social media to talk about how they feel, how they support, what their brand stand for, asking consumers how they're doing, trying to be really, really relevant, So this has been really successful, and I see it standing. Another one is click and collect services. Click and collect has always been there in one form or another in retail, but I think the necessity of click and collect for retailers during COVID lockdowns, when the government obviously prohibited in UK, some types of retailers, the click and collect has been thriving. And I know that, in some some surveys I've seen, about 30% of consumers wanted to stay and tried it. And it's also environmentally much more friendly. And the last one, I think video kind of, the touch point of video appointments, whether it's in customer service, whether it's showrooming something in the store, whether it's trialing products. I think even very traditional retailers, I'm thinking like Carpetride, for example, in UK, extremely traditional, retailer, and their competitors. If I look at that space, they've all adopted video appointments, and I think once they've done that, technology-wise, they're going to be using it ongoing, and customers also going to be more willing to use it. I think NHS is taking about 50% of their appointments now online. So if NHS is doing it, then it's here to stay. So those
the vaccination website crashed last week, I think, in the UK.
Oh, is it?
Yes. But yeah, I think that's an interesting point around the some of the phenomena we have now that we didn't have, let's say, 100 years ago. Tyler, with a kind of real estate hat on, what's your perspective on this? Do you think shoppers' behaviour will return in any respect to the kinds of behaviors that we've seen pre-pandemic?
I think it's the big question, right? I think when I look at it, putting the real estate hat on, as you mentioned, I think of it from a physical real estate standpoint. And I really categorized it into two buckets, one being experiential retail, and the other, as Olga mentioned, more the necessity commodity-based retail. You probably saw, many of the listeners probably saw Kimco and Weingarten formed an alliance, which two very large commodity-based U.S. retail REITs will now become one. And I think now that will be the highest valued retail REIT in the world, with like 600 open-air grocery anchored shopping centers and mixed-use projects, over 100 million square feet. So the CEO, Connor Flynn, my company knows him well, and his comment, and I think he's been published saying this, is that that should be a very clear indication of how they feel about the future of physical commodity-based retail, that merger, because they paid a premium from a share price on Weingarten. So I think that, one of the interesting things about that type of the physical retail is that there's a large focus on companies like Kimco, Weingarten, and others that are really looking at, and maybe Mark can comment on this, really looking at the development of more mixed-use projects within the residential space around their shopping centers. Not a new idea, but it's a real keen focus of theirs now, and it's a part of the evolution of brick and mortar retail from that standpoint. The other side of it, I would say, more on the experiential, and I'll bring back something I kind of disagreed with in your presentation, Jonathan, just to make you happy, I think.
Thanks.
And Sid mentioned it. I think that the concept of the chrono-urbanism 15-minute radius, I get it. I understand the efficiency and the convenience that can drive it, certainly from a captured customer base from a real estate perspective. But I think, if anything, this pandemic has shown us, when given the choice, people will ultimately not want to live virtually to the extent they can. And experiences and interaction are really still going to win. That's my fundamental belief. So when you think about that from an experiential retail standpoint and how that product class will evolve, I think of a lot of examples of this adaptive reuse of what was traditional, suburban mall, which the U.S. is obviously renowned for its dead suburban malls. And I think that's been going on pre-pandemic, and it was just exacerbated. But what's interesting now is what's happening to it. And we touched earlier on the third-party logistics and the adaptive reuse there, but even more on the experiential side, some of these big boxes that are now turning into, a company that is out of North Carolina that's called Skiptown, and they're really focused on what was traditionally dog boarding and daycare for animals. Now that has moved into a full front retail standpoint on bar, food and beverage. They're looking for suburban malls. They're looking for urban infill locations. So you've got companies that I would say come from a non-traditional business line that are now forcing themselves into what was the traditional retail play. But you've also got, companies like Convene and Industrious and some of the flex operators that are really blending across product categories from a retail, office, and hospitality standpoint. And so now they're feeling and acting more like traditional retailers, because really their modus operandi is really all about employee attraction and retention. And so those employees are the new retail customers for those businesses that are forcing a different experience for their tenants that feels more traditional retail.
Interesting. And thanks for disagreeing with me, because I also think that 15-minute city is not very practical for existing cities. It might be fine for a new build.
Personally, I'm dying to travel and get out of my 15-minute bubble.
Exactly. I can't wait to get to the airport, to be honest. But what we have to recognize, I suppose, as well, is parts of Asia, we've already started to see, post-lockdown experiences, and certain types of behaviors persist post-lockdown. If you look at China, we see, live streaming, luxury online, social commerce being, quite dominant forces. What have been the experience in other geographies? I mean, Sid, talk to us a bit about India. You talked about decluttering the offer in India. Was that in response to changing consumer behavior that you observed, or was that a sort of an organizational response to the innovations that Amazon had introduced?
Yeah, I think that was more an evolutionary sort of let many saplings grow in the beginning, and then as we observe product market fit, sort of double down on the business models that made sense and where the customer traction and cost structures sort of allowed us to project in the long term a large and profitable business, and sort of merge the others into it. But to answer your specific question, I do think there are a couple of big trends to what Tyler's also saying, which is that I've heard anecdotally from many families that, the grocery shopping trip, which is now sort of morally accepted as a worthy excuse for leaving the house, has become the entertainment highlight for the week, right? So that's a sort of countervailing force to online and virtual shopping, right? Which is that the very tactile experience of being in a retail environment is a refreshing sort of entertainment destination in a strange way, in a world that doesn't allow you to have any other entertainment destinations outside the home. Another sort of biggie for me has been the learning that as a business operator, you can no longer predict over the medium to long term what your business will look like, right? In terms of sheer top line. And so we've seen in the past 2 weeks, a couple of cities in India which imposed lockdowns again, doubling in volume as those lockdowns go into effect. Just as in the previous 3 months, those cities may have seen drops in volume as everyone thought the vaccines have arrived and we no longer have to shop for grocery online. So it's very unpredictable. And I would argue that it'll take very flexible sort of day-to-day operating plans to be able to operate at this level of ambiguity for any retailer.
Yeah, and I want to go on to some of the responses that we've seen in a few moments. But if we get away from the sort of the immediate kind of pandemic consumer behaviors, one of the things that we mentioned earlier was around sustainability, and to what extent do we think that consumers embracing of sustainable growth will be part of their future retail choice behavior going forward? Mark, is that something that you feel strongly about?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the awareness that we're facing this existential crisis is becoming more and more profound with every passing day, really, isn't it? And I think that as a trend in retail is definitely going to play out in the way that people consume and the way that how people think about what they do every day, let alone just what they're consuming in the retail environment. And I think I just see that trend growing. And that coupled with community and the trend towards people now engaging more with their local environment and engaging more with their local sort of service providers and makers and retailers, and I think is really going to be very, very interesting to watch over the next while. And I think the retailers who are not aware of that and are not focused on that trend are going to really struggle.
Well, how do we square the circle between kind of demands for convenience? My son's kind of ordering stuff that arrives on a Sunday, and sequential ordering times and so on, immediate delivery, and that sustainability set of values. Are those reconcilable, do you think?
Probably not. No. I think people are going to need to. The other trend that needs to tie into that is the plastic and the awareness of the issues of plastics on the globe, and how the way that we're consuming disposable retail, and we can just go out and buy some plastic tap for not a lot of money, and then throw it away a couple of days later. And I think that the awareness of that and the impact of that on the world, I think is going to be significant. So I'd like to see a trend towards people spending potentially slightly more money on things that last that much longer, and which is actually just going back to a trend from, well, where retail was 50, 60 years ago.
I was genuinely surprised to see in the Jeff Bezos shareholder letter last week that he's actually done the math, and to the extent that he has a stake in this, we should take it with a pinch of salt. But the math he's done, and I forget the exact numbers, are that the average e-commerce fan goes out and does 50 deliveries, therefore saving 50 individual cars going back and forth to presumably high streets or supermarkets.
Yeah.
Now one can do that and argue how he's calculated it and all of that.
Yeah. But, it's a good point, and I think it's to put that research out there. It's really interesting because, of course, what that doesn't account for is whether those other car journeys do or do not take place. Because what we may also start to see is that people say, well, thank you for the delivery. I'll now go out and do some enjoyable shopping instead, and they go out as well. So I think the unit of measurement is the important thing on this. Sometimes it's actually, are we measuring the household's sustainable footprint or the efficiency of a particular logistics route? And I absolutely agree that with electric vehicles, with optimized algorithms for logistics, you can get a very sustainable delivery, but that relies on your resident shopper not also going out and doing stuff, I suppose, which is an interesting kind of challenge.
I think it also doesn't take into account the amount of packaging.
Split. Although there have been some ambitions to go packaging neutral or carbon neutral on packaging.
But also returns, right? So you almost have reverse logistics in fashion, for example. I think Zalando, ASOS, we're talking about 60% return rate. So it's huge. Therefore, multiplying it by 2, I think, would be fair.
Okay, well, that sounds like a great basis for the funded research to be done, perhaps here in Oxford. I don't know, the next few months. I'm conscious of time. We're going to take another 5 minutes on the panel discussion. I wanted to shift us really to the implications of all what we discussed so far for successful business models going forward. And we've had some comment in the chat, and I will come back to these. And I'll ask perhaps our panelists to respond to some of these chat comments if we don't get time to during the breakout session. But there's one comment about Amazon Fresh having open stores in London. I think 3 or 4 now having been opened in London. Are there grounds for optimism for the physical role of retail continuing? We heard some comments earlier from some of you about the continuing importance of experiential retail, and we hear a lot about experience and theatre and so on. Do you see any interesting initiatives taking place? Again, perhaps I could start with Tyler on this one. Where do we see some of the innovation here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a couple of things. One, the brick and mortar is essentially serving now as a customer-based fulfillment, right? And I think that speaks to that one comment. I think Sid can certainly speak to that better than I can. But from a distribution and logistics standpoint, the use of the store as last mile fulfillment and pickup is, I think, an interesting trend. I mean, that was exacerbated by obviously the acquisition of Whole Foods, and which to me felt very much like a customer-based acquisition. But more on the merging of different product types. I think it is. I think what you will see coming out of it, and away from retail a little bit, but as the office world turns back on, thinking through what people are going to demand when they come back into those environments. And we've seen the effects of the traditional retailers that surround and support more urban office environments just being pummeled by this. Obviously, mom and pops like dry cleaning and sandwich shops and things like that have obviously been just empty for months and on end. When the world turns back on, you'll see a revitalization of those, again, more needs-based local retailers. But I think what'll be interesting is what do we all expect to come back to when we come back to work, right? What is that office experience going to need to feel like? Because we have, for better or worse, gotten used to what this new environment brought us. And I think that there's been challenges with families and kids and dogs running in Zoom meetings. I'm sure all of us have experienced that, but it's also brought us a lot more free time, a closeness with family, shedding the commute hours. There are certain things that I anticipate the world will not want to give back up. And so what does that mean from a retail perspective? And how does that asset class traditionally merge with what we would go to from an office standpoint? I think that's where that's where it's going to get interesting with some of these as-built environments start to blur the lines a little bit more than they have traditionally. I think there's a force function from COVID that will come out of that. And, some of the efficiencies, and I don't know, I mean, I don't have the crystal ball, right? But some of the efficiencies that you may gather from Sid's example of, what an outing to the grocery store with the family is now something that you look forward to. How will consumers and office workers view their commute to the office, whether it be 1 day a week or 5 days a week, in a similar fashion? What will they demand from that experience? And can retail fill that gap in a way? To me, that's I think where it gets a little bit interesting and challenging too.
I wanted to, before we conclude and break out into our groups to consider these questions a bit more, with just one question for each of you. If you had just one recommendation for a retail CEO or for a senior leader involved in the sector, what would it be?
I think it's just picking up a little bit more on the environmental aspect. And there was, can I plug a book? I know that there's only one book. Yeah. There's only one book we can plug today, isn't there?
I managed to plug mine, so feel free.
No, but a book that I read recently that really resonated was the "Let My People Go Surfing" by Yvon Chouinard, if I said that correctly. But I mean, there's obviously, it's a very specific business model and it's a very specific brand. But I think a lot of the topics that he picks up on in that book and a lot of the issues that he grappled with himself and with his business, I think are really relevant across the spectrum. So I'd say read that.
Very good, thank you. Olga.
Yeah, well, coming back to online and digital, I still see a lot of CEOs kind of being ignorant of online and, not believing that we are facing this reality, and moreover, not being educated about how to run online business. And it's very different from running physical store with a website. So, I would advise to educate themselves as much as possible, get their hands dirty, get into those reviews and really upskill themselves about digital, because it's here to stay. And that's what's going to be one of the winning kind of strategies for the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Tyler.
I would say, one of the things that I try to reflect on is that, first of all, Mark, I love that book, so great recommendation. But one of the things I try to reflect on is, plan for the long term and be careful not to overreact to current trends. I think there's absolutely valuable lessons and opportunities that can be gleaned from the current crisis. But I've also been, I sit on boards of a few companies. There's been an immediacy to the reaction of COVID at some stages to the cost of their own business model. And I think that it's important to really remember what worked well pre-COVID and how can you make small adaptations to survive in both environments, but not forego your prior business.
And Sid, come to you last, but not least, because I think you have some really interesting insights and challenges within the Indian market, and I'd be very curious to know what you would suggest. Let's say particularly for Indian retail CEOs at the moment, in thinking about the future.
Well, our largest competitor in India has taken us to court over an acquisition. So since that's subject.
Well, in which case, feel free to go outside India then and be broader in your answer.
But I will say this, which is that retail is about scale. And for scale players, what we're seeing is that if you do not take into account the impact you have on the community and the stakeholder environment at large, and perhaps the company I work at is a great example of one where we've reached a scale where we, our CEO, or now our executive chairman's primary goal is to figure out what we need to do to show the world that we're a force for good on our stakeholders, right? Mm-hmm. He spent a lot of his time figuring out how to compute and show the world that we will be, if not good for the environment, at least carbon neutral, and the first major retailer to do so at our scale. Similarly, to be powered by the renewable power sources in the next 5 years and so on, which all goes to say, hey, shouldn't you be focused on increasing shareholder wealth? But actually, it turns out that when you get to a certain scale, you cannot afford to ignore the triple bottom line that I actually learned about at Said. The impact you have on stakeholders in the community is what matters at that kind of scale. So for me, that would be the big takeaway. When you get to scale, you do not have a choice to not focus on the stakeholders that you impact across the spectrum.
I think that's a good final piece to finish our discussion on. I think that's a really critical insight that we have to share. So we've only scratched the surface in many of these quite complex and uncertain issues, and there's been a lot in the chat, and we will take the opportunity to respond to some of you that have made some observations there. I think Sid has responded to a number of the Amazon type questions before he had to leave us. But I hope we've shed some light in the last 90 minutes, either from my own presentation or from the panel members' contributions, or from your own discussions in those breakout groups, on what is really a fascinating sector undergoing yet again, some remarkable transformations. And I subscribe to Alan's view that acceleration is always with us as far as this sector is concerned. And so I want to thank Olga, Tyler, Sid, and Mark for their great contributions to the conversation. Thank you also to those of you that remained for joining us and for contributing to the conversations. And I think, again, this shows us the breadth and depth and expertise we have amongst our alumni. So with that, thank you, and I'll pass back to Viola, I think, to conclude the session.